Going. But we do have the moment to speak about another issue that is concluding. Now, I just want us to conclude on the matter of Acting Inspector General of Police, Gilbert Masengeli, who on Friday will be going to court for sentencing after being found guilty of contempt of court. Dudley, tell us what the options are on Friday for the court.
Okay, so the first option is for the court to find that Masengeli has grossly violated the Constitution by failing to produce the Longtons and Bob Njagi, and by dishonoring the many summons that he has. We hope that the court picks that option of saying that the convict is now unfit to hold any public or state office in the Republic of Kenya. Then the court can give a jail sentence and order him to report to jail and begin serving a sentence, 6 months for each of the court orders disobeyed. We also hope the court picks that option as well. Then the other one would be a fine to be paid from his salary. We hope that the court goes for the maximum available sentence, and the court has a discretion in whichever sentence it will impose, because the power to punish contempt is a first power that any court worth its name has. Anything called a court must have the power to punish contempt. You know that the Contempt of Court Act was nullified in 2016 as it stopped contempt of court proceedings. So the court has immense power. And sometimes people think that, the court is not, people think that someone can run away from that process, but just the court being lenient, because the conviction could have been made on the disobedience of the first order. So the power to punish contempt is a power that no one should joke with. If they think otherwise, let them ask Jacob Zuma. Former president, spent time in jail because of contempt in court. Those who know do not joke with that power.
Okay. In the event, and this is, of course, we're past that because now he's been convicted of contempt of court. But I want to just take you back a little bit. If the court issues a warrant of arrest for somebody because of failure to honor court summons, in this case, this would be someone at this very high-ranking level. How would such an arrest be effected? Because it would essentially be requiring junior officers to arrest their boss?
My question would be, who arrested Jacob Zuma? The court can order him to report to jail, and the court can suspend the sentence and order that he must serve it in his lifetime. But the court has the power to direct him to which prison facility to report to, and that order must be given effect.
But he can appeal, because that's what we see in the court.
Now the court has yet another power if he does appeal. The court can deny a contemner audience until he complies with the court order. In this case, the court can deny audience until Bob Njagi and Aslam Longton and his brother Jamal are produced as per the first order.
Okay.
So the power to punish contempt is an immense power. Yes.
Yeah, and important to remind us of what this whole case is about. To begin with, it was the habeas corpus that was filed. Those three have remained missing since August the 19th, and no one knows of their whereabouts and whether they're being held anywhere, in a jail cell or a prison. So thanks for that reminder. But this has not been a good year for the executive, Eric. There's been quite a number of cases that have been lost or nullified. If you take a look at the shift laws for which, they were given 120 days to go out and regularize, the Finance Act of 2023, whose details we'll not go into because it's before the Supreme Court at the moment. There was the office of the CAS that was declared unconstitutional. Even the Adani deal that is now, and that's also before the court. But so many of the government's actions and plans are being challenged in a court of law. Why is this?
Because we have a country that some institutions are kind of working. I don't want to paint a very gloomy picture. I, for one, believe the judiciary is working in terms of trying to test different proposals that the government or laws that the government has passed and looking at them in terms of their constitutionality and all that. But I think that we need to put this in context. It is not unusual for a government that has newly come into power to come up with several lofty proposals, to come up with very ambitious agenda that they do not then take time to test, and also to overpromise, like in the case of the chief administrative officers. I was here
Yes.
about the same time they were appointed, and I told them this is going nowhere, and they didn't listen. So to sometimes overpromise and come up with the lofty agenda that do not meet the test of time and test of constitutionality. And this, I think, is what has largely happened in the case of many of the laws, particularly those reforming the healthcare sector. And now you can see the issue of the airport. I mean, nobody who has gone through JKIA would deny the fact that there's need for infrastructure development.
Right.
The question is, how do you go about it? And how will it be perceived, particularly if it looks so sudden? And I think that is really, and of course, when there are labor issues concerned, like employees fearing that they will lose their jobs. So I think that, I think in the last 2 months or so, finally the Court of Appeal came up with what I think has been a missing test in terms of how do you actualize public participation that is envisaged under Article 10 of the Constitution. It has always been the case that so long as parliamentary committees go around the country or receive some kind of memoranda in Parliament, then according to them and many other public institutions, that test is met. I think the Court of Appeal went further and we understand there's an appeal going on, went further to kind of give oxygen to it and say that, okay, you are still free to disagree with the memoranda that have been presented, but you have to give a reason. You have to give a reason why you are disagreeing with the proposals that the members of the public are bringing forward. Because there are several stakeholders who have interest in these laws. You've just seen members from the banking industry talking here in one of those news items. So I think it is high time that our friends who are in the executive now move the next step, the next critical step, to ensure that when they're coming up with public proposals, when they're coming up with new policy agenda, when they're coming up with new laws, that these laws are not cosmetic. They're not meant to achieve perhaps short-term as opposed to more sustainable. And by the way, sustainable development is part of the values in the Constitution that then eventually respond to the diversity of Kenya. The diversity here means that people have different interests in different laws and policies, and that then ought to be given serious consideration. Otherwise, my additional concern, now more from a lawyer's perspective, is that the government probably is also incurring a lot of costs in defending some of these laws that if you just went through a more inclusive, a more productive public participation process, then you probably will save the public a lot of money. And you see, this is not money that belongs to a cabinet secretary or president or anybody. This is more or less public money. So there's need for some prudence in developing these laws, and importantly, ensuring that there's not much litigation that could be avoided. But, and this is the final, I think litigation is good. I think it is good that civil society and members, and particularly lawyers like Mr. Chelu, are more into public interest litigation, that they are testing decisions of the government, particularly where other fora for checks and balances like Parliament are perceived to have failed.
And the judiciary is usually, the place of last resort when it comes to seeking refuge for many Kenyans. But some have termed what's been happening in the courts as judicial activism and overreach in certain respects. Wanjiru, what are your thoughts with that?
Well, the court is called to be, quote-unquote, activist because the Constitution of Kenya seeks to overthrow the poor governance that we've had, that really built up since independence. the purpose of the second liberation was not just to reintroduce multi-party democracy. It was also to curb the excesses of an imperial presidency that had really destroyed the economy, marginalized large parts of this country, and compromised public the public sector through patronage. So we must remember we are on a path of building this country called Kenya and trying to separate ourselves from a past that inherited or retained the character of the colonial government. So we had a political elite that became the neo-patrimonial elite and subverted public processes for land acquisition for their benefit. We've got a manufacturing and business enterprise that was also very captured. So the purpose of the Constitution is really to release our economic and political system from the shackles of self-interest of a few. That has created marginalization, has created poverty, and now has and so the Constitution calls for a court to be very proactive and to be sufficiently activist. In fact, it calls for all of us to be activists because rule of law exists to protect citizens from the excesses of the executive as they exercise their duties. It also puts responsibilities on citizens to obey the law, but also to disobey and to resist efforts to subvert the Constitution. So Article 3 calls on citizens to exercise peaceful civil disobedience. That is our duty, to resist. And we've had, before we had the Gen Z uprising, the Gen Z revolution, and I call it a revolution because it's a revolution in the way we engage with the state. The young people came and told us, we are not here to be cowed by power. We are not going to be cajoling and coaxing our political leaders to follow the law. We are demanding because it's their duty. So actually the courts are spot on, and that's why we really hope that the Friday ruling will be as proactive and as clear as possible to say do not mess with the courts, because we've been treating our Constitution like a suggestion, and where Kenyans, or rather the executive has, and where state officers and public officers violate the law, even though the public is not happy, even though the media talk about it, even though civil society may talk about it, all we've done is talk. And while we've done that, like you said, we were looking at, it's the CAS case, the Finance Act 2023, SHIF, the Adani housing levy. If we're going to look at the corruption things, we're talking about edible oils, fertilizer subsidy, we're talking about the contaminated sugar, KEMSA, NHIF. I mean, we're saying this is untenable. People are dying. People lose their lives because they go to hospital and there's no medication. You go to a public hospital and there's a qualified doctor there who then doesn't have the means to care for you. You have to buy the medicine. Those are we have roads that are built, and because of the corruption, they are substandard. And so you have car accidents, you have lack of enforcement, lack of compliance. So we are living actually very insecure lives because of very poor governance, and the courts are called to be very activist in protecting and enforcing the Constitution and as our citizens. So we need to reframe the narrative, and what the president, or not the president, what William Ruto is trying to do. We are seeing an executive under attack. An executive that has lost legitimacy and is afraid because the majority have called them out. And he has then used the state apparatus of fear and death, and has taken us back to the Moi days when you had, these kind of abductions, these kind of killings. And he's trying to actually, these three, Bob Njagi, Jamil Longton, Nadim, were running an X space calling out governance failures. Why do you abduct? Why do you kill? Why do you arbitrarily arrest people, young people who are complaining about cost of living and poor governance, rather than recognize the opportunity to reset, to say it is not sustainable to procure an overseas expensive bilateral loan that is inflated by some 60%, has no return on investment, and really has driven us into a monetary and fiscal unsustainable position. So let us not allow the PR gimmicks of the executive and this kind of impunity we are seeing with the DIG or the acting IG. I don't know whether he's still IG because of this conviction. Let us not allow them to create the impression that it's business as usual. It's not business as usual. Kenya is not in a good place. Our numbers aren't balancing. Our institutions are being, when you look at Adani, that's a case of outright corruption. We saw this in Russia when you had a privatization scheme. You run a country down, the economy down. You then sell off state assets. In this case, you lease them, and you violate the law. If you look at the PIP, the PPP law, you need to have a socio-economic impact assessment. You need to ensure there is return on investment. You need to ensure there are so many governance stages, even if it is privately initiated. Those still apply. And then, of course, eligibility of the company that's coming to provide this service. And I hear, they're also trying to get in, and possibly they're doing other work in Kenya. They want to get into the Ketraco, because now we are talking about lack of investment in our electricity infrastructure. So we cannot have political interests undermining our public services, and we continue to keep quiet. That is what this is about. It's about resetting our country.
Okay, and that's interesting. In the course of all of these events, with all of these deals and laws that the executive tries to pass, and Dudley, you talked about this, at the beginning, there is a legal advisor, the Office of the Attorney General. To what extent, perhaps help us understand the role that they play, for instance, in when we're saying, okay, we need to do something about our airports. What is the role of the Attorney General? Okay, we need a law governing our health insurance, our National Health Insurance Fund. What is the role of the Office of the Attorney General? And to what extent, by law, is the executive and the president bound by recommendations, advisories from this office?
Okay, so we had a former Attorney General, Beda Njoka Muturi. I think, though he refused it, but he was sacked a little bit after that. His last public statement on the newspaper was that the president does not listen. And people around him, it's in the public domain that the president advises his advisors on how to advise him. That's why he's filled State House with many of them. They're nearing 500 or 300, there are many advisors. But he still comes out and makes the decision he wanted to make. It's in the public domain that some of the bills that go to Parliament, the Attorney General sees them when they've been published. It's the Attorney General's duty, in collaboration with the Kenya Law Reform Commission, to initiate legislation and policy, to draft, to perform that constitutional check. So we're getting so many nulls and voids because that internal check system is not running, because the president wants to run the country based on his wishes and thoughts instead of what the Constitution says. And yet we are a country governed by the rule of law and not the rule of man. So the Attorney General occupies a central place. In fact, in this matter that's before the court, the one where Masengeli has now been convicted, the Attorney General should also be summoned to explain what's happening, because under Article 156, the Attorney General's first and primary duty is to defend and to protect and to promote the public interest, and the rule of law. They're the chief law person of the government, not towards arbitrariness or unlawfulness, but towards the rule of law. So whenever there's a default, the Attorney General should also be asked questions. What kind of advice did you give? In this Masengeli case, what kind of advice has Dorcas Oduor, Senior Counsel, given a client, Masengeli?
Tell me, because we are now talking about, what's happening at the highest level. Earlier this year, just literally at the start of the year, President William Ruto talked about obeying what he called corrupt judges. And he talked about judicial impunity that he said is unacceptable in the country, saying that he would defy, court orders that stand in the way of development. And when asked to defend himself, he then talked about, what happens within the judiciary and that some of these rulings and verdicts are coming out of what he called, quote unquote, corrupt judges. This started in January, and then we've seen everything that happened thereafter, including where we are now at the moment. So, what's your response to then when the president makes a statement like this? Because it sounded very similar to, you remember when former President Uhuru Kenyatta said the same thing and had this huge barrage against a number of judges whom he did not name and, the ones that he did not appoint. I mean, should we disobey corrupt judges?
Well, I would be worried if the president were happy with the judiciary. I would be extremely worried because that dalliance between the judiciary and the executive is not healthy. It's not healthy for the rule of law. It's not healthy for the judiciary. And we've had judiciaries like that, where it was said there was a direct line between State House and the Supreme Court building. I'm happy that the president is unhappy with the judiciary because it means that the judiciary is doing its work. And for context, was that the time that the courts had nullified the housing levy, where we know people who have commercial interest in the steel and cement going into that? Maybe that's why the president was unhappy and the judges are not corrupt, because we have a Judicial Service Commission where the president is represented, first by the Attorney General, two, by the two members of the public whom the president appoints, and three, the other executive-leaning member is a nominee from the Public Service Commission. And so if the president has real evidence of corruption, he presents it to the JSC, and we've had judges removed through the JSC. So it's a process that works. In fact, sometimes it's the president who appoints friendly panels to save judges he does not wish to have removed.
Yeah. Juris pesa. That's a word that's now going around. Because, we got to turn it the other way around. Is there a...
Yvonne, Dudley and I will tell you that if you practice law in this country, there's a good chance that you've experienced losing cases. We do that every day. Most of my friends lose cases for reasons that have nothing to do with them. Sometimes it's just the client had a weak case. We don't complain. We understand that that is how the process works, and you have the right to appeal up to the Court of Appeal. In fact, some Kenyans have exercised up to the East Africa Court of Justice,
right.
Issues of jurisdiction aside.
Yeah.
So I will not get into the politics of why successive presidents have been unhappy with the judiciary when they don't get judgments in their favor. I think that the jury is out there. I think everyone is smart enough to tell the political context under which they operate. I'll be more concerned about a government that is keen to attract investments into the country, that is keen to host international conferences to showcase Kenya and our potential going forward, trying to portray institutions that offer checks and balances as biased. Because I am very much aware that that is what investors look at. That's one of the,
yes.
the boxes they want to tick,
right.
to check that if you disagree with them,
yes.
if the deals go bad, then they will have an independent, objective institution to arbitrate over the disputes, and in this case, that will be the judiciary. So I think it is important to urge everyone to restrain themselves from attacking all institutions that generally arbitrate over disputes, including arbitrators. We do have arbitrators in this country who are private practitioners, and to help build these institutions and create mechanisms for challenging decisions of individual officers you may be in disagreement with, which is normal. Some of these people are your classmates, your disagreements here and there. Some of these people you may have worked together here and there. Things do happen. Yeah. But not to then lump up the entire institution, particularly if it is coming from the upper echelons of executive, to then portray that element of incompetence, that element of biases, which is for the most part not true. Remember, most of the accusations, the accusations against some of the judges have always been around when they serve in the Judicial Review Division and the Constitutional and Human Rights Division, because by their very nature, these are the divisions that check more or less day-to-day actions of the state. So when the disappearance of this gentleman, then obviously you go for habeas corpus. Yes. So it is normal that this caliber of officers will be in limelight, at least during the time they are serving there. And so before you make serious allegations against them, you also have to understand the context of the cases before them. In this particular case of Masengeli, we are talking about 2-3 fairly young gentlemen, you will call them Gen Z for argument's sake, who are basically using social media to basically engage the public. I mean, I've joined social media, it's called X Spaces. I've joined them several, I've never talked, but I've joined them severally and understood the kind of discourse that goes on there. I occasionally agree, occasionally I don't agree, but I keep quiet and listen and appreciate that at least we now have a platform where 50,000, I've been to one where there was 100 plus, 100,000 people can meet over 2 hours, have a discussion, and they're not in Uhuru Park. Yes. You see, that tells you we're a progressive country. So if then you move to a point where you now disappear them, and this is now more or less about 20 days, and there's a mechanism under Article 51 of the Constitution, habeas corpus, for them to be produced in court, to be entitled to fair trial within 24 hours and all that, and then you make this become international news, and you can imagine how then our freedom of information and freedom of the media then become under increasing scrutiny across the world. So I think some of these people exercising executive powers, administrative powers, whatever it is, they ought to be called out. And by the way, it doesn't matter which office you occupy. Sometimes it's just good to tell you that, this is wrong, and let's deal with it. And I think that is where we are headed, and I'm happy that those who are being pinched the wrong way are feeling it, including Mr. Masengeli, who will have to account, I think, to the public on Friday. Yeah. I wanted to take our closing round of comments now.
Wanjiru, so many would say, look, if I was summoned to a court and didn't appear, because, the IG was given several chances to do so. Just a quick one, Dudley, how many times would I need to ignore the courts for me to be found guilty?
Once.
Okay.
Yeah.
So once for me?
Yeah.
But 7 times for the Inspector General of Police. So what does this say, Wanjiru, for...
No, you need to clarify that.
Yes.
I think we may not understand the entire context,
right.
But that's already enough to tell you how that court is more restrained to ensure that the IG gets opportunity to present his side of the story. Exactly. 7 times. Yes. That's very serious.
Yes, that, he's been given one opportunity after the next. And I believe even the one on Monday was at his request, following, the appearance of the deputy IG, who said, okay, he can present himself on Monday. And then, Monday came and we all saw what happened. But I think the idea of my question was just to show how many chances the court accorded to him. And perhaps ideally, for every other person, it would be you fail to appear in court. There would either be, a warrant of arrest that would be issued, and then, the rest would then take its course. Wanjiru, what does this say? Why should I obey the courts? what we're seeing. So it's just, what are the consequences and what sort of precedent does this set in our democratic space in the country at the moment?
Right, and I think you've hit it, because the intention of this refusal and this contempt is really to undermine the legitimacy of the courts. And the question then becomes, how does an acting IG be so bold as to fall into contempt of courts unless he's got the blessing of the appointing officer? So this is really back to what William Ruto said at the beginning of the year, which is my development agenda or the Constitution. And there is no dichotomy between a development agenda and the Constitution. The Constitution is supreme, and it governs all of us. And actually, only the people can then organize themselves to change provisions of this Constitution, because all the other authorities delegated from the people. So it's really back to that foundation. Really, what we are seeing is an executive that's very uncomfortable with the law, and unfortunately, William Ruto has, I would say, shamed himself, in that there were a lot of people who are very skeptical about him and the fact that he was able to ascend to that office, given his background, because he has cases of corruption every time he's worked in public office. Much as they weren't concluded one way or the other, they were there. There's YK92 was had paramilitia, associated with it. So the electoral violence that we saw in Kenya in the 90s was associated with an outfit of which he was intricately part. Not to say anything of the post-election violence. Despite all this very dubious background, he managed to ascend to the highest seat. And Kenyans gave him a chance. So note, we are not yet at we are now at the 2-year mark this month, or last month. Now that we are Kenyans were very patient, waiting for this reformed person to bring that promise of bottom-up development, of a Kenya based on rule of law, of dealing with the economic challenges through structural reforms. But all we've seen is really conmanship and showmanship. We've seen, a person who parrots really attractive slogans, but then does the exact opposite. That is why we are seeing the conduct here of the acting IG. And of course, like we said, the risk then becomes that this is set as a precedent if it's not challenged. It also means that those who are intent on speaking out and upholding the Constitution then become very insecure, because if the courts can't get the IG or a state officer to hold the line, then who will protect our rights? Because rule of law exists to protect us from this, from state excess. So it's really important that he's disciplined. It's really important that the courts are very decisive on this one, so that they can reinforce this moment, because we also have an opportunity, and I'll go back to that. Yeah. We have an opportunity to reset our governance. This is, in a way, when William Ruto campaigned, he promised to reset our economic governance and our structural issues, and he's then betrayed that. And instead of fighting the state capture, he's looking like he and the people around him look like they want to become the capture themselves. And Kenyans, I think maybe the last point is that the ground has changed. The voter, this voting bloc, because once they register, they are a voting bloc, about 11 million of whom did not vote in the last election. Either they didn't have the voters' cards or they refused to show up, are very enlightened voters. They are ahead of, I think they are setting the agenda for civil society, for government, maybe in some cases for media. And this government has no idea how to deal with an empowered voter that is exercising their agency. In that, they are losing an opportunity, because this is a generation for the future. Because really, as a country, we are playing in a global arena. And the ability to create jobs, the ability to remain as a dominant player is how well we tap this resource.
Okay.
So rather than tapping this ingenuity and this amazing capability that was unlocked by free education, we then have a privatization scheme that is seeking people who benefited from free education through the HELB are seeking to deny the youth of today that same privilege. So it's about impunity, but it's also about a missed opportunity vis-a-vis the resources and the talent that we have in our youth. Our youth, our future belongs to the young. Why is this older generation saying, no, we must remain mired in this failed governance?
Yeah.
Because Kenya has all the symptoms of a failed state. Because when the state when you don't obey the law, when laws don't apply, they are written in the books, but they are not implemented. That is a manifestation of a failed state. So we have these contradictions in our governance that needed to be ironed out.
Yeah.
And because, our leadership has missed that, it's up to the judiciary and citizens to really resist and to fight for our constitutional order.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. I want to take your final comments, but first, let's talk a little bit about IEBC. That was one of the cases that were there. And please update us. Something has happened because, there was a bit of a tussle over who would be in that select committee that would then, shortlist and candidates for that, over who would be represented in that select committee. Dudley.
I understand that today the Political Parties Dispute Tribunal has delivered its judgment. And I think that case has stayed. The judiciary should have done better by expediting that case. Because we need IEBC reconstituted, because we have some 5 or so recall elections to hold. So we teach the MPs a lesson about who their loyalty should be to. Anyway, the PPDT has quashed the decision by Azimio to substitute Augustine Augustus Muli for Koki Muli, and has directed that PSC should not present a list to the president that does not have the name of Mr. Muli. And so we hope that PSC will present that name and the president will reconstitute the panel so we have the IEBC in place. Important because of Banisa, because of Magarini, and because of the boundaries review.
Yes.
That we are past
the deadline. Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah, and also, there's the newer ones. Now that we've had, some people going into government who are representatives of the people in the National Assembly. So that is something to follow, because that has also, taken some time. And it was also then overtaken by a political process of what was supposed to be, a legal process when NADCO came in. So your closing thoughts and comments on where we are as a country and why this is such an important conversation to have?
I'm glad that the government annoyed people the way it did, because we woke up from our slumber and realized the power of our constitution. You remember that last year the president banned protests. See that hakuna mtu atawahi nifanyia maandamano tena in this country. Last year, banned protest, killed an article of the Constitution, Article 37. Well, the people have reclaimed that back. But there's something more important, and that's public participation. It used to be that public participation was like a PR exercise. You put people in a little place, then you tell them whatever you want to tell them, and that's the end of it. And now people are submitting memoranda. Parliament is receiving memoranda in record numbers. And that's the true power of public participation. That's how it was meant to work. The other thing is that public participation depends on civic education. Because when you are educated on what your options are, you can provide better input to the body that's considering the decision. And I just love the level of civic education going on. I must pay allegiance to the likes of Morara Kebaso and his students, and the likes of Njambi, who are auditing county governments, Boni Mwangi, the other Boni Mwangi, who is not as well known.
On X.
Yes, the guy doing audits of the county beautiful things. That's how you bring the Constitution alive. That's how you give the people their power back.
Indeed. Eric, in a minute.
Even, I must admit, I'm one of those who underestimated the Gen Z movement until it happened. And then it struck me that something has eventually happened in Kenya which might be irreversible. And I did mention to one of your colleagues that part of what I'm struggling with as somebody who researches on this thing is that I suspect most of our political players, mainstream political players, are still applying the old medicine, that of elite consensus, that of trying to bring political parties to kind of, form coalitions and in the process try to walk out of the main issue. And I suspect that may not work. It's just mentioned Morara. Morara was in part of my class when I was teaching at Kenyatta University, and I've known him outside that, although it's obvious that he didn't finish for reasons beyond him.
Yeah.
And I'm just happy that he's taken a different route. Totally just focusing on, not taking side, just focusing on the projects and researching into the money that has gone into it and all that. That's very enlightening. So I think that the political leadership, particularly in the executive, and I think now in parliament, now that this Gen Zs went to parliament, need to wake up and realize that the ground has shifted. And importantly, that they now have to do two things. First, be responsive to who their constituents are. You need to identify who your constituents are. And I think they should know that the constituents are the wananchi who elect them and not the political colleagues they do meet in Nairobi. And two, and I think this is also critically important, they need to appreciate that it is important to protect institutions, whether it is the judiciary, whether it is parliament, the institution as it is crafted in the constitution and its core mandate, whether it is constitutional commissions or for that matter the executive, that you need to preserve the institutions by letting them do their mandate, avoid unnecessary politicized attack. If you have a mandate like that of the IG or acting IG, please execute it, but within the confines of the law. And that means you have to be checked by the courts. And if you have been summoned by the courts, please respond in a positive and progressive way that takes our constitution forward. For your information, somebody like me did not know this gentleman called Masengeli until around 1 month ago. That means he can also leave just like Mr. Koome left, and nobody's talking about Mr. Koome now. Yeah. So that's enough to tell you, don't personalize these institutions, make it work in terms of the Constitution. And I think the more we preach this for them, before the Gen Zs probably devise another means, the better they respond. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for that. And we wait to see what happens on Friday, as well, and how this goes forward. Now, just as we close, to remind you of the breaking news, which is that there is a go-slow by the Kenya airport workers. Their union had, of course, issued a strike notice earlier in August. I believe it was on the 12th, and have been engaging both the Kenya Airports Authority and the Ministry of Labour. Tonight, they're on a go-slow, and that is hampering the travel for hundreds of passengers. We sent a crew to the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. They were turned away and have not been allowed to film what is happening at the airport here in Nairobi. But we will definitely get you the details of this, what it looks like. We hear there's traffic jams. We hear there's people, of course, who remain stranded, and we see whether any flights will take off and what the travel looks like for several hundreds of passengers who are there. But this has been our conversation on the state of rule of law in the country. Friday is a big day in the country. We shall be here to tell you all about it and what happens there. Many thanks to my guests, Ochiel Dudley, Wanjiru Gikonyo, and Dr. Eric Komolo. We really appreciate your time and your insights on the program this evening. And of course, as well, to you, much of that feedback is online. You can track that on X. The hashtag is The Explainer. Thanks for watching our program tonight. I'm Yvonne Okwara. Good night.